Well, what I thought I would do is say a few words about critically important events and critically important non-events and the criteria that distinguish them, which are usually pretty sharp. And this is a good month to do it. Yesterday in the Irish Times, there was an article, one of thousands of articles, on the critically important event that we're commemorating and celebrating in November, in fact next week, the fall of the Berlin Wall, liberating Eastern Europe from its Russian masters. The Irish Times article was about a very important meeting that took place in Berlin. The three presidents who were critically involved at the time, George Bush, number one, Helmut Kohl, and Mikhail Gorbachev, met and discussed what the newspaper calls the burning issue. Now, the question: who gets the credit for breaking down the Berlin Wall and opening up Eastern Europe to the West? And they debated it. Bush, to his credit, said it's the people of East Berlin and Eastern Europe who should get the credit. They finally achieved the rights that their God-given rights. And Gorbachev said that the United States should have a period of perestroika. That sort of was off the topic. And Kohl ended it up by saying only, yes, he agreed, it's really the people, not us, important as we were. And but basically he said only heaven could have brought this miracle about. So that's who was responsible. As soon as I read it, and there's a raft of such articles. In fact, the New York Times has an open competition for people to tell where they were when it fell, how they reacted, and so on, which is okay. This is a critically important event. We should commemorate. The first thing that came to mind when I read it was the Grand Inquisitor chapter in Brothers Karamazov. You recall the story. It's in Seville at the height of the Inquisition, and there's a tumult in the streets. Turns out Jesus Christ had appeared. He was immediately picked up by the security forces and brought to the Grand Inquisitor, and the Grand Inquisitor explains to him why he's going to have to execute him, because he has to put an end to the evil works of Christ, who's just bringing misery to the masses by trying to bring them freedom. And the masses of people don't want freedom. It's going to make them miserable. They may think they want it, but they don't. But what they want is worshipful obedience, complete submission to authority. And the Grand Inquisitor has the task of ensuring that they have complete submission to authority. It relates in some way to the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it relates even more closely to a non-event, an important non-event that took place about the same time as the fall of the Berlin Wall. In fact, 1 week later, exactly, on November 16th, 1989. On November 16th, what happened is that the story of the Grand Inquisitor was effectively enacted in the real world. Christianity was brought to an end the second time. The first time was when Constantine converted and turned the radical pacifist religion, which people were persecuted, into the religion of the Roman Empire. So the cross, which was the symbol of the suffering of the poor, became the symbol on the shield of the Roman Empire. And from that point, Christianity pretty much shifted from the radical pacifist religion of the poor to the religion of the rich and powerful, pretty much living up to the admonishment of the Grand Inquisitor that people have to submit to absolute authority, and we're bringing them happiness by allowing them to do that. And if you don't want anyone comes with Christ's message, we're going to have to kill him. Well, encapsulating a lot of history and cutting off a lot of edges. In the early 60s, there was an effort to revive the Christianity of the Gospels, namely after Vatican II. It's called liberation theology, especially in South America, but elsewhere too. The bishops undertook what was called the preferential option for the poor. Bishops and lay people, part of this was that lay people should participate directly. They went out to poor peasant communities, set up what were called base communities where poor people read the Gospels, thought about what it meant. It's a subversive doctrine, so you're not supposed to read it really. Maybe read the words, but not think about them. They were supposed to think about it and turn it into ways to act to achieve their basic fundamental human rights. Well, taking the preferential option for the poor is a grave sin, and they had to be punished. They'd be executed. The nearest thing to a grand inquisitor around is, actually there are two, the U.S. government and the Vatican, and they combined to put an end to the heresy. The Vatican, and in this case, we don't have to ask whether heaven helped, because we know who helped. They're proud of it, in fact. If you take a look at the website of the School of the Americas, famous School of the Americas, changes its name now and then because its past is too ugly. It's called, I think, Confession, equivalent of Confession. So you change the name, but it's the same School of the Americas, which trains Latin American killers. One of their talking points, advertising points, is that the U.S. Army helped defeat liberation theology, which is quite true. The Vatican helped by kicking out the dangerous radicals who were daring to preach the Gospels, and the U.S. Army helped by just killing them. That episode from the early 60s ended on November 16th, 1989. That's when the judgment of the Grand Inquisitor was applied, actually much more harshly than the Grand Inquisitor, because he actually permitted Jesus just to leave town. But these two Grand Inquisitors didn't do that. On November 16th, an elite unit of the Salvadoran Army, armed, trained, directed by the United States, which had already killed tens of thousands of people, the usual victims, peasants, labor activists, and so on. They murdered, blew out the brains of 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests in El Salvador, along with their housekeeper and their daughter, So that was the massacre of November 16th. The reaction to that, and that essentially ended this episode, not in one day, but the symbolic end of this heresy of the effort to revive Christianity. It sounds like an important event, but there won't be any commemoration of it. In fact, any memory of it, I doubt if many of you even know about it. In the United States, probably nobody would. In fact, I have in my office at MIT, I have a painting given to me by a Jesuit priest, which is a symbolic representation of this event. And what preceded it shows the angel of death, and right underneath the angel of death is a painting which is supposed to represent Archbishop Romero. He was murdered while reading Mass in 1980 by pretty much the same forces, kind of a hideous decade. Not only in El Salvador, it was worse in Guatemala, it was horrible in Nicaragua and so on. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, in a substantial measure of war against the church to punish them for the grievous sin. And so the Archbishop Romero was killed in 1980. He was killed, I'll finish with the picture. He's in one position. Right below him are the faces, intended to be the representations of the faces of the 6 Jesuit priests and their housekeeper and their daughter. put it there just kind of like to remind myself of the real world when I come into work. But it's turned out to be an interesting Rorschach test. Who knows what it is? Well, it turns out from the United States, almost nobody knows what it is. From Europe, maybe 10%. From Latin America, in the early years, everybody knew what it was. Now, fewer, because young people are also getting indoctrinated and diverted from the important events of the world to the events that serve power. So it's kind of an indication of the significance of this event. Something else happened. Immediately after the murder of the Jesuit priests, putting an end to this murderous, brutal battle which had gone on. It includes other events too, like the overthrow of Allende, the neo-Nazi state instituted by the Kennedy administration in Brazil, and the hideous the horrors of Argentina, and a long series of things that followed from the early 60s heresies. And this is essentially the end. Now we have a piece of the graveyard, so everyone's happy. A few weeks after this, Václav Havel came to the United States. He's now the hero of the other event, the real event that took place. He gave a talk to a joint session of Congress, and he got standing ovation, rousing applause, when he praised the United States as the defenders of freedom. This is right after they had murdered 6 of his counterparts, finishing off the brutal and murderous events that had taken place in between. Well, just imagine the situation's been reversed, and that gives you a sharp indication of what's an event and what's a non-event. Suppose that Havel and half a dozen of his colleagues had been murdered by a Russian trained and Russian-led elite battalion that had already killed tens of thousands of Czechs, and that the same things were going on in Poland and Hungary and so on. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, any imaginable form of independence crushed by violence. And imagine that after this, Father Correa, rector, one of the people who was killed, the most distinguished Jesuits who was killed in El Salvador, whose name nobody knows, of course, wrong side, non-event. Suppose that he had gone to Moscow and spoken to the Duma and had gotten a rousing ovation for calling the Russians the defenders of freedom. We'd know about it. In fact, we might not know about it because it might have led to a nuclear war. But it certainly would be a major event. I mean, ultimate horror, how could this happen in a civilized world? Well, that's their the difference between their crimes and our crimes. Their crimes are horrendous, and tears at our heartstrings, and so on and so forth. Our crimes disappear very quickly. They're gone. Forget about them. They didn't happen. Wiped out of history. And we're right in the middle of it right now, on the 20th anniversary of these 2 historic events: the breakdown of Russian control over Eastern Europe and the destruction of Christianity. Replaying Constantine living out the words of the Grand Inquisitor, except more brutally. And we know which ones want to be commemorated and which ones want to be forgotten. Has been forgotten. In the United States, at least, as far as I know, there's only one commemoration of this anniversary. It's at the Catholic University in Boston College, where one of the surviving Jesuits, young Sabrina, will in fact attend. We'll also be talking about it, and a couple of other people, and a small gathering of people, many fewer than this, will be there remembering what happened. But if there's a reference in the press, I'll be amazed. If anyone on the Harvard faculty knows what's going on, I'll be astonished. Maybe 1 or 2 people involved in solidarity activities. Well, that is characteristic. It's not just the media, of course, they go along. It's the academic world. It's the intellectual culture. And it extends just about over everything. And with just one illustration, which is so grotesque that it's hard to voice, but it's also very recent. The New York Review of Books is perhaps the leading liberal intellectual journal in the world, pretty close to it. They had an article by a well-known liberal commentator 3 months ago in July, in which he was reviewing a book by a major American historian, a collection of essays. And he starts off the review by saying that he learned a great deal from this book. It was quite interesting. One of the things he learned is that when Columbus came to the Western Hemisphere, we no longer say discovered, it's not politically correct, but when the encounter took place, Columbus and the Western Hemisphere, he found a hemisphere that was essentially empty. From the steaming tropics to the Arctic North, there were maybe 1 million people, stragglers, hunter-gatherers, kind of wandering around in the wilderness. And then, of course, the continent got civilized and so on. Well, it's been known for decades that the number of people was maybe 80 or 100 million, that there were major cities, major civilizations. About the only difference between them and the Europeans was that they were much healthier. They were conquered by European savagery and European filth, which spread diseases. They were much healthier, and they didn't have the same weapons. So they were destroyed, exterminated, essentially. Well, that's genocide denial with a vengeance. It puts Holocaust denial in the shade. This is a major left liberal intellectual journal. I waited to see if there'd be a letter. No letter. A couple of months later, there was like a 4-line correction saying, which was worse than the original. Okay, that's our crimes. And they're okay because we carry them out in first of all, guided by the will of Providence. American history is highly providential. It's one of the diseases we picked up from England. So everything that's done is following the will of God. And the city on the hill, the shining city on the hill, as Reagan put it. He said that would be the last, but this will be the last reference, which refers to one of the first examples of what's called now humanitarian intervention, namely the arrival of the first British colonists in Massachusetts. The city on the hill comes from a sermon that justifies everything you do, even if it's a mistake for the city on the hill. It was a sermon by John Winthrop in Massachusetts in 1630, praising our mission. The year before, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had gotten its charter from the King of England, and the charter was given so that they could carry out the mission of saving the pagans from their miserable fate. And they established a great seal, which you can find on the internet. It's usually hidden because it looks as good. But you can find it on the internet. The great seal of the Bay Colony of Massachusetts that shows an Indian with his spears held down, sign of peace. And out of his mouth is coming a scroll. And on the scroll it says, "Come over and help us." So that's what they were doing. They were coming over to help the native people, answering their plea, what we call humanitarian intervention. And in the process, they happened to exterminate them. But as was pointed out by leading scholars, preachers, judges, and so on, Providence has strange ways. Somehow they faded away as the superior race entered. Nothing we could do about it. That's the way history is recorded and accepted. It's what people are taught in colleges, internalized, write about, present to the next generation. And it leads to events and non-events, memorable ones and forgotten ones, all important. but crucially distinguished by a very sharp criteria, which is hard to miss.
Thank you, Noam. Now I'm going to ask Noam to tell you a very good story, which I stopped him telling at lunch today. He thinks it might be true, and it's about George W. Bush and the prophet Ezekiel. And I stopped him telling it because I was sure it would be worthy of a wider audience. I haven't heard it, but I'm going to now.
Well, actually, I learned this story about 5 years ago, and I couldn't believe it, so I never published it. But it's since been verified, so it's true. Here's the story. I received a letter and an article from a well-known Belgian theologian. The article was a learned dissertation on a very obscure passage in Ezekiel, which nobody understands. It's the passage about Gog and Magog coming from the north and leads up to Armageddon and so on and so forth. I mean, nobody knows whether Gog and Magog are people or places or some other thing or whatever they may be. So the passage is extremely obscure, but it enters into evangelical Christian theology. Gog and Magog are whoever your current enemies are. So when Reagan talked about these things, Gog and Magog were the Russians, and they were coming down to do all kind of horrible things. Now, Gog and Magog are, at that time, this is January 2003, was of course Saddam Hussein, and he was presumably coming down to attack Israel, and leads to Armageddon, the souls that have been saved rise to heaven, everyone else dies. The Christian evangelical tradition of which this is a part is very strongly pro-Israel. They're one of the main pro-Israel blocs. But they are also the most anti-Semitic element in the world. They're in history, probably. Their picture is all the Jews will be killed. I mean, unless they happen to convert in time. Can't get more anti-Semitic than that. Anyhow, Bush was meeting with Jacques Chirac, the president of France. He was trying to convince Chirac to join in on the war against Iraq. Fortunately, he didn't have that problem in 10 Downing Street. Didn't have to quote Ezekiel. But in the course of the discussion with Chirac, he started going on about this, Gog and Magog and Ezekiel and so on. And Chirac had no clue what he was talking about. So he approached the Élysée, the Foreign Office, asking him, "Can you explain to me what this maniac is raving about?" And they didn't know. So they approached this Belgian theologian, who explained to them what it was all about. Well, that's what we've survived. It's kind of amazing that we're all alive. But we've survived a world in which the finger on the button that can destroy us all in 5 seconds is often some world where Gog and Magog are coming around. And it was the same with Reagan. In fact, it's been the same for the last few years. And for years, a large part of the fate of the world has been in the hands of one lunatic who's waiting for the second coming, and Armageddon and so on, and another one who's waiting for the 12th Imam, who's about to die. Human survival. If somebody was watching this on Mars, they would think that human survival is a miracle. The way it can continue like this, and chances are it can't.
Since we're talking about God, we must move to Downing Street. Tony Blair obviously has a special relationship with God. God, it appears, does not give him any advice. And he didn't say, Tony, this Iraq thing may not be such a good idea. I wonder if you could tell us, Noam, why statesmen either want to be close to God or why they want to be Winston Churchill and Roosevelt. There seems to be a World War II fascination with these people. You don't have to explain Tony Blair to us, but I'd like that as well.
I didn't try. There's a lot about Winston Churchill that is pretty hair-raising. I'm know more about it than I do. But
the Irish do too.
The Irish have heard of him too. For example, just to give him one example, he was sometimes refreshingly honest. So back right before the First World War, he gave a speech in the Parliament, which he later published, but editing out all the interesting parts, later discovered in the paper somewhere. And in it he explains why we have to rule the world. He says we've gained control of vast amounts of territory by violence and terror and robbery, and now it's ours, and we've got to maintain it, and we have a right to protect it. And he went on later in his history of the Second World War to say that we are like rich men living in their ample habitations who just want to be left in peace. So leave us alone, ruling the world, don't bother us. He then went on in 1944 to order the Army, to the Army Command, to develop a plan which he called on them to implement in May 1944. They wouldn't do it. It was called Operation Unthinkable. Operation Unthinkable was a plan he wanted them not to destroy too much of Germany because we'd need them, to employ the Wehrmacht and the RAF and the American forces to attack and destroy Russia. This is 1944, when the Russians are fighting the overwhelming bulk of the war against the Nazis. And Churchill is planning an operation to destroy them using the German army. Well, that's been pretty well hidden. It was finally declassified a couple of years ago, but I don't know if it's been reported anywhere, but you find it in histories of British intelligence. So he's an interesting character, a lot of interesting things. I'm sure you can add plenty more. So why do people either want to be close to God or close to Roosevelt and Churchill? Well, Roosevelt and Churchill, easy. They won. And you want to be close to the people who win. Maybe you can win.
And the enemy was Hitler.
And the enemy was Hitler and Saddam, Hirohito, and so on. What to say about that, but Hitler certainly. The Japanese was a more complicated story. Why to be close to God? Well, that's a British-American perversion. It goes back very far. It goes back to England, which was a providentialist culture. God guides us and tells us what to do. In the United States, the colonists who came over from England were mostly religious fanatics. They were kind of extremist religious elements, and they carried with them the providentialist streak in British culture. And it lasted right to the present, like George Bush, same thing. We're fulfilling God's will. God has strange ways. Westerns it turns out that the native population fades away before our glory, but we're still fulfilling God's will. And since we're the shining city on the hill, how can we go wrong, even if we occasionally make mistakes? So it's really good to be close to God. It justifies everything you do. This was combined in the United States with another British lunacy, the Anglo-Saxon racism revival, which took place around the Reformation. We're pure Anglo-Saxons, it goes back to the book of Tacitus, Germania, in which he describes how the Aryan race developed somewhere around near where Iran is, and they were a new species, tall, blonde, big brains, courageous, intelligent, just a totally new species. They migrated to the German forests. There they became Teutons. They then migrated farther west, and they conquered the British Isles. And then in the later version, they migrated across the Atlantic, and they became the Americans. Thomas Jefferson, for example, was a great believer in this. Some of them made a mistake. Some of the Aryans intermarried with the populations they conquered, and that led to racial degeneration, so you get the Mediterranean cultures, which are sort of dirty and inefficient and so on and so forth. But the pure Aryans never intermarried. They just exterminated everybody. So they kept Anglo-Saxon purity. That's why Britain was such a fantastic place to conquer the world. And then right through the 19th century, in the United States, the Anglo-Saxon mythology was very widespread. When the U.S. conquered the Philippines, General MacArthur, Arthur MacArthur, who was in charge of it, talked to Congress. This is about a century ago, early 20th century. He explained to Congress, this was at a time when they conquered the Philippines, they killed about a couple 100,000 people. That was again in order to civilize them and uplift them, lots of worthy objectives. And he explained to Congress that we had to do this because we're following the will of God, and because we are the Anglo-Saxon race, the pure Anglo-Saxon race, and we have to follow the tradition from the German forests on through England, ourselves, to benefit the rest of the people of the world by exterminating them. They'll be happier when they're exterminated and the Anglo-Saxon race takes over. And this is all God's will, because we're following the will of Providence. It's kind of unbeatable. So yeah, it's a good line.
Let's follow the God bit, democracy. In 2006, the Palestinians had a fair election and were stupid enough to elect the wrong people, Hamas, and they're still being punished for it. Were punished then and are being punished now. Then in June, which I had the dubious pleasure of witnessing, Ahmadinejad was elected by a impossibly high vote as president of Iran. When I was asked to ask him a question immediately afterwards, I called him Mr. Ahmadinejad, Sir, which was my slimy way of avoiding calling him President Ahmadinejad. But nonetheless, after lots of sort of sulking, we kind of accepted it. Then we have the elections in Afghanistan, which were obviously fraudulent. And the Americans insisted on a runoff because they didn't believe Karzai was necessarily a legitimate president. Then his opponent refused to participate in the runoff, which would of course cost a lot of Western lives. We don't care about the Afghan ones. And then yesterday we learned that the election tribunal, which is run by one of Karzai's apparatchiks, said that he is now the president, there won't be a runoff. And he got the congratulations of Gordon Brown and your president, Obama, who had earlier said that this was a complete fraud. So they're now congratulating an utterly fraudulently elected president, and presumably going to send the 40,000 members of the US cavalry quite soon to help. Can you unravel this for me and for us? No?
The one thing about it that's puzzling is that Gordon Brown came first. I thought he would wait for Obama to do it, like Blair would have, I think.
He's a stallion on a leash.
But other than that, it's like so normal that you can't say anything. In fact, it's even recognized by scholarship. So democracy promotion is one of those slogans that everyone's in favor of. Actually, we have now a lot of Russian archives. When the communist apparatchiks decided to become a third world elite back in 1990, one of the things they did is sell everything off, including the archives. So there's now a lot of archives, and there's a whole scholarly industry called Cold War history, which is poring over the archives to see if they can find something that will justify what the U.S. did during the Cold War. It's not turning out so easy. But some of the stuff in the archives is interesting, and it's about this. I mean, you have these gangsters talking to each other internally, not for public, any public ears. Gromyko, Molotov, all of them. And they're talking very sincerely about the need to protect democracy in Eastern Europe from the fascist attack led by the United States, which is trying to undermine it. And I'm sure it's perfectly sincere, no indication that the KGB is listening. That's what they believe. And it's the same that you hear Western diplomats talk about their dedication to democracy promotion. Now, this has been studied. The best scholarly study of this, if you want to look at it, is by Thomas Carruthers, who incidentally is a neo-Reaganite. He's very much in favor of democracy promotion. He thinks it's a wonderful thing. He writes both from the inside He was in the Reagan State Department working on democracy promotion objectives. And as a scholar, he's a careful scholar. He was head of the Carnegie Endowment on Law and Democracy or something, where he's writing these things. He wrote several books on the history of democracy promotion. They're going way back, right through the Reagan years. During the Reagan years, what he knew from the inside were his fervent commitment to democracy promotion. He points out that there was, in fact, progress towards democracy. This is about Latin America. There's progress towards democracy in Latin America, namely in the South, where the U.S. had very little influence. And he said the Reagan administration tried to prevent it, but they couldn't, and nevertheless there was progress for democracy. In the surrounding region, where the U.S. had much more power and influence, he said there was no progress toward democracy, in fact the opposite. And he says because the U.S. would support only particular forms of democracy that left in power traditional elites that would act in conformity with U.S. interests. So that's kind of a paradox about the Reagan administration. But then he extends it. He said the paradox extends to all administrations. He said in every administration, the United States supports democracy if and only if it conforms to strategic and economic objectives. And he says all leaders are somehow schizophrenic. They need psychiatric care. They don't see that there's something strange about this puzzle of their supporting democracy. I think of another reason, but that's his conclusion. But he does record the facts correctly. It goes right through the second Bush administration. And it's a great surprise to anybody who is purposely blind about history and policy for it. It's one of those puzzles, like the fading away of the indigenous population when we came to save and Christianize them. History is full of such puzzles.
Last question too, Noam, preceded by a memory of mine when I first went to Israel in 1976. I thought it was a very European sort of country, good phone system, nice food, democracy, parliament, everything. When I go there now and see the settlements and the wall, not a security fence, please, a wall, I wonder if it will survive. And it was a Jewish friend of mine in California when I was about to give a talk some months ago, who we were looking at the wall of the hall where I was to speak. And Jewish philanthropists are extremely generous in the United States, and of course most of the names on the wall were Jewish. And I said to Jeffrey, my friend, I said, do you think, what do you think, if you were an Israeli, would you live there or would you live here? And he said, I think, Robert, this might be Israel. And that place to the south of Lebanon where you live is a small colonial project which may or may not work. And I recall how I used to think when I first went to Yugoslavia, long before the war. I believed in Yugoslavia. The Yugoslavs did not, as we later discovered. Will Israel survive? No?
Well, there always was the dark side, even in the days when it was a very attractive place. I mean, I lived there early 50s, I often thought about going back. As late as maybe 15, 20 years ago, I considered, my wife and I, that if we had to leave the United States for some reason, we'd probably go there. Now I think I'd prefer to come to Dublin. And it changed. I mean, there was a dark side, very dark side. I mean, it's a settler colonial society. Settler colonialism is the absolute worst form of imperialism because you have to act like the Aryans and the Teutons in the myth that's our Anglo-Saxon origin. You have to exterminate the natives or get rid of them or something. That's a part of settler colonialism, so it is absolutely the worst kind of imperialism.
You are telling us the history of Ireland at the moment as well.
Yeah, right. So you can add your own piece to it. And so, of course, Israel was the same. A lot of ugly things. But it's true that the part of the society that we would run into, that I would see, that you would see, was a very civilized, westernized society in the best sense. It was like a Scandinavian social democracy. And that's changed. Now it's very much like the United States. It has very high inequality. The social system has collapsed. A lot of wealth. Very advanced high-tech economy with tremendous amounts of poverty. And that's even excluding the settlers and the wall, which is just an annexation wall, and all the other horrors there. So will it survive? My feeling, actually I wrote about this shortly after the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, that the worst enemies of Israel were those who were supporting it. What they're in fact supporting is Israel's moral degeneration and ultimate destruction. And I increasingly think that that's true. In fact, you could see it very quickly. So in 1971, President Sadat of Egypt offered Israel a full peace treaty in return for withdrawal from occupied territory. Now, he didn't care one way or another about the West Bank and the Golan Heights. What he cared about was Egyptian territory. So in return for withdrawal from Egyptian territory, they could have had full peace. Well, peace with Egypt means major security problems are over. That's the only meaningful military force in the region. So there was nothing for the Palestinians in this, incidentally. It's the early 70s. Palestinians weren't an issue. So nothing for the Palestinians, full peace, in return for withdrawal from the Sinai. Well, at the time, Israel was carrying out they were just planning substantial settlement programs in the northeast Sinai, which they were driving out tens of thousands of Bedouin farmers, driving them into the desert, destroying towns, mosques, graveyards, everything. They were putting up a lot of settlements in one big city. They were planning a city, Yamit, 1 million people on the seacoast. That was the civilized period. And they had a choice at that point, very clear choice. Do we choose security or expansion? Okay. They chose expansion. They rejected the offer. Now the critical question, as always, is what's the boss going to say? The boss in Washington. What he says goes. And there was a debate internal to the U.S. government. We don't know all the details yet because it hasn't been fully declassified, but there's enough to figure out what happened. There was a conflict between the Secretary of State, William Rogers, and the National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger. Kissinger had his primary enemy in the world was William Rogers, because way down somewhere was the Russians. The reason was he wanted to become Secretary of State, in which case he would run everything, not have divided authority. So if Rogers said it's raining, Kissinger would tell Nixon the sun is shining. That's the way the bureaucratic battle went. Well, Rogers was in favor of accepting Sadat's proposal. In fact, it was pretty close to his own proposals. So Kissinger had to be against it. And Kissinger had a policy which he called stalemate, no negotiations, just force. So he succeeded in winning the bureaucratic battle. He soon became Secretary of State. Rogers disappeared. He backed Israel's rejection of Sadat's offer. That led directly to the 1973 war. Sadat kept saying repeatedly, if you're going to build Yamit, it's going to be war. And Israel and the United States just laughed. Arabs don't know which end of the gun to hold, that kind of thing. Very racist period. Okay, 1973 war came along. It was a very close thing for Israel. They were on the verge of destruction, literally. Moshe Dayan was ready to commit suicide. They apparently loaded their nuclear weapons. Kissinger called a nuclear alert. The whole world came close to destruction. Well, they managed to carry it off at the end. And if there's one thing Kissinger understands, it's force. Maybe that's why he got the Nobel Prize. So he recognized you can't just write off Egypt as a basket case. Then comes the reconstruction of history that academics and the media are responsible for. What followed after that was what was called shuttle diplomacy. Kissinger, the grand diplomat, is flying up and back everywhere, getting people to talk to each other, carrying out a noble mission. And finally, in 1978, this is harder now, Israel, the United States, and Egypt made an agreement, the Camp David Agreement, which essentially accepted Sadat's 1971 offer. Now that goes down in history as a great diplomatic triumph. Kissinger gets the Nobel Prize, Carter gets the Nobel Prize, and it's wonderful. In fact, it was a diplomatic catastrophe. I mean, what happened is that they rejected in 1971 the offer which could have ended the conflict. And in 1978 and 79, they were forced to accept it after a major war, terrible potential, could have been even much worse. A lot of suffering, a lot of bloodshed, but they finally accepted it. Okay, diplomatic triumph. And since then it's just been downhill. You cannot carry out a military occupation, becoming occupiers, and maintain your elementary moral values. You can't be robbing people, killing them, stealing their land, stealing their resources, without becoming racist. I mean, if you're crushing somebody, you've got to have a justification. And the only justification can be their evil nature. That's kind of universal. It's right through the history of imperialism and conquest. It's their evil nature. You know this way better than I do, but like after the Irish famine, British historian, leading figures were coming here and saying, of course, the famine has nothing to do with us. It's the evil nature of the Irish. I remember one English historian, I forget his name, described how awful it was here after the famine, which of course the Irish were responsible for. And he said, when you get to Ireland, what you see is human chimpanzees. But of course we see that all over the world, Africa and Southeast Asia and everywhere else. But what's particularly awful about it in Ireland is that the human chimpanzees have white faces. Well, that's no good. They're supposed to have black faces or brown faces or something. But it's their fault, and everything we do is their fault. It's another historical universal, and another one is that there's a category of people called intellectuals. They're supposed to make this look good. That's an
I think we better have some serious questions now from the floor. Just a few, but anyone want to ask a question of Professor Chomsky? There's a gentleman over there. Speak up.
I'd like to ask, the political conversation in the United States and the political debate often seem very detached from reality, especially from, say, Fox News. There's no connection to the real world. Why do you think that is?
I don't hear.
I'm telling you, it's okay. Political debate in the United States seems to be very detached from reality, especially things like Fox News. Why do you think that is?
Same reason it is everywhere else. Do you know of a place where political debate isn't detached from reality? And in fact, there's a kind of a correlation. The more powerful a country is, the more detached, the more crimes it's committing. It's almost automatic. And hence, the more detached from reality discussion has to be. I mean, if you're, some small country somewhere, say Ireland, they don't happen to be committing massive crimes at the moment outside. So yeah, you can be a little closer to reality. There's less to conceal. There's less to delude people about. Actually, Bob corrected me the other day in a column in The Independent. He applied a phrase, manufacturing consent, which I in fact had plagiarized. And he says it's the wrong notion. It should be manufacturing deceit.
I should add that the column began with the words, Professor Chomsky is right, and it ended with the words, Professor Chomsky was wrong, which is why he's bringing it up now. Carry on. Anybody else? Lady over here. Just speak up and I'll...
The view that you kind of espouse on the same of is quite uncomfortable and at times depressing view of the way things are at the moment. And I understand why people want to believe things that they're told, even only because it's kind of a more hopeful view. I'm just wondering, do you kind of see any sort of hope that isn't due to change everything that we're doing? Does it kind of irk you that at times it does seem to... You have to question constantly whether or not any decisions are taken in good faith and whether or not everything has become cynical. Is that the only way that you can kind of address what's going on in the world?
I don't think you can have hope that everything will change, but you can have hope for progress. In fact, it's a very realistic hope. Just think over recent years. Countries like Britain, the United States, others have become much more civilized. And it's because of activism, mostly young people, mostly people your age, who, at the beginning of the 60s, but kind of went on from there, and it just repeats earlier patterns. Just became engaged, active, involved, and changed things. So the activism of the 60s began in part as a reaction to disillusionment with John F. Kennedy. But Kennedy came in with the same kind of charisma, PR, and so on that Obama did. And of course, people were disillusioned. Never had any intention of doing anything decent. And instead of giving up, they started becoming active. So the civil rights movement, which of course had always been there at some level, really took off in the early 60s. It was mostly students. It began with black students in black colleges in the South, elite black colleges in Atlanta, sitting at lunch counters, later riding freedom buses. They were joined by young people in the North. But pretty soon it was a mass movement. It compelled Kennedy to back off and support, at least verbal support, for the civil rights movement, which then led Johnson, the ex-president, to pass non-trivial legislation. Legislation which gave the blacks at least the formal right to participate in society for the first time. Formal right, I emphasize, because other things didn't change much. But that was a big step. Okay, that was a major factor that led to the anti-war movement, which kind of took off from there. There were other strains. And 4 or 5 years after Kennedy started the war, there was a substantial anti-war movement. And it was significant. And it continues. There's much more opposition to aggression today than there was, say, at any comparable stage of the Vietnam War. That's one reason why Bush couldn't use the tactics in Iraq, could not use the tactics that were freely available to John F. Kennedy. No saturation bombing, no chemical warfare, horrible enough, but could have been a lot worse. There's a constraint. In the 70s, the feminist movement took off. I mean, again, it was always there. It was there for centuries. But it really took off in the 1970s, an outgrowth of the activism of the 60s, including quite interesting things if you look at the internal dynamics. So the leading edge of the anti-war movement in the 60s was the resistance. These were young men, mostly, who were taking serious risks. It's not fun when you're 18 to say, okay, I'll go to jail for 5 years, or I'll leave the country and never come back. And that's what they were doing. And they wanted to feel morally upright about it. But if you look at the inner workings of the resistance, I was right in the middle of it, so you could see it. It had the standard sexist assumptions of the time. Young women did all the shit work, and the men were out being grand and giving speeches. And women started to protest. And that led to a lot of kind of moral concern. In fact, it even led to suicides. But it was because how can we be brave and upright and moral while at the same time we're doing this? And it was one of the strains that led to the youth element in the feminist movement of the 70s, which just expanded all over the place. So like, say, my own university, MIT, if you walk down the hall in 1960, it was white males, 100%, well-dressed, ties and jackets, deferential, polite, and so on. You walk down the halls today, it looks like this. And that's a big change. It's a change that reflects the society becoming more civilized. And later you get things like the international solidarity movement, which is unique in the history of imperialism, never been anything like it. The justice movement, all sorts of things. Well, that's progress. And why should it stop? should go on and can.
Just one more question. Gentleman with the spectacles there. Yeah, you, that's it. Yep.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, a lot of the things that you talk about it really brings, to bear, the crimes that are carried out by America and so on, and how they're ignored. And also you talk a lot about, you say in some cases where we really have to focus on, what's responsible, so what the American government is responsible, what America has to go to, what the American government is responsible, rather than China or something. But on the other hand, for all that we can talk about how terrible capitalism is or how terrible Iraq is, it's hard to get away from those particularly serious areas like Darfur or Rwanda or the Congo or something, where...
So can you come to the question? I think we're running out of a bit of time, yeah.
Where the main crime seems to be apathy or something. So what is there any possibility for humanitarian intervention that doesn't have an ulterior motive or that doesn't have terrible consequences?
Is there any chance of humanitarian intervention which doesn't have an ulterior motive? I think that's basically the question.
Conceivable. If you look at, actually, there's a major scholarly history of humanitarian intervention between the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, which outlawed war, and some recent period, I forget what it is. And the scholar, a serious scholar, found 3 examples of humanitarian intervention. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, Japan's invasion of Manchuria, and Hitler's takeover of the Sudetenland. Now, he didn't mean that they were real humanitarian intervention. What he meant is those are the 3 cases where a strong case was made that it's humanitarian. And that's pretty typical. There are other studies that go way back. Sometimes they find one example, the French intervention in Syria in 1860 or something. But then if you look at the details, it's just part of France trying to establish its power. Maybe the British intervention in Sierra Leone would pass the filters. I don't know. I haven't looked at it carefully. But yeah, it's conceivable. But, it's a little bit like Gandhi's alleged answer to the question, what do you think about Western civilization? And he's supposed to have said, well, it might be a good idea. Same with humanitarian intervention. Yeah, it might be a good idea. Now, if I caught what you were saying, you mentioned the Congo. See, that's kind of an interesting case. The Congo is absolutely the worst catastrophe going on anywhere, and has been for years. No talk of intervention, or even anything. Darfur is a huge issue in the United States. One of it is here. Save Darfur committees. That's pretty awful, no doubt. But it isn't a fraction of what's going on in the Congo. So why, of course, nobody talks about doing anything, just let's shriek about it. So why Darfur and not the Congo? Well, it's not hard to figure it out. In Darfur, you can blame it on enemies, the Arabs, the enemies. So they're doing it. So it's terrible. If you look at the Congo, it's a little harder. For one thing, the worst atrocities are carried out by Rwanda, which is Washington's closest ally. So that part's out. The other thing is that the multinational corporations are all over eastern Congo where the fighting's going on. And they're using the militias who are slaughtering everybody to gain control over the rich resources of the eastern Congo. And you should all be applauding, at least all of you who have cell phones, because that's where the coltan comes from. And the same with much else. So, making a big fuss about eastern Congo is kind of difficult. It's a little bit like this January 2006 election and free election in Palestine. I guess the only free election in the Arab world. It's not nice to talk about that while we're prating about democracy promotion, since we, U.S., instantly moved in to punish the population, partially for voting the wrong way. And Europe, as usual, kind of toddled along politely. So we don't talk about that one. And the same with the Congo.
I think I'll end with a tiny historical anecdote that Professor Chomsky may not know, he referred to the French involvement in Syria, which of course was the civil war between Christians and Druze in Lebanon. It was called the Anti-Lebanon and then the Lebanon Federation. But in fact, the French went in to protect the Christians. The British arrived on warships, which they moored in Sidon, and went to defend the Druze. And they said that if the Druze would accept British protection, they would have a particularly unique offer for Druze tribal leaders. And that is that the British would arrange for their sons to go to English public schools. On that note, I think I'd better thank you. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to wrap up by once again thanking the guests for coming. Professor Chomsky and Robert Fisk have taken the time out of their schedule free of charge. They don't charge anyone for doing this. That's why we're able to do what we do. So on behalf of the committee and the College's Arts Society, I'd just like to once again thank you, the guests, for taking your time.